Chapter 12, Part 2 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 12, Part 2. Tom entered as the words were spoken, with a radiant smile upon his face, and rubbing his hands, more from a sense of delight than because he was cold, for he had been running fast, sat down in his warm corner again, and was as happy as only Tom Pinch could be. There is no other simile that will express his state of mind. "And so," he said, when he had gazed at his friend for some time in silent pleasure, "so you really are a gentleman at last, John. Well, to be sure." "Trying to be, Tom, trying to be," he rejoined good humouredly. "There is no saying what I may turn out in time." "I suppose you wouldn't carry your own box to the mail now," said Tom Pinch, smiling, "although you lost it altogether by not taking it." "Wouldn't I?" retorted John. "That's all you know about it, Pinch. It must be a very heavy box that I wouldn't carry to get away from Pecksniff's, Tom." "There!" cried Pinch, turning to Martin. "I told you so. The great fault in his character is his injustice to Pecksniff. You mustn't mind a word he says on that subject. His prejudice is most extraordinary." "The absence of anything like prejudice on Tom's part, you know," said John Westlock, laughing heartily, as he laid his hand on Mr. Pinch's shoulder, "is perfectly wonderful. If one man ever had a profound knowledge of another, and saw him in a true light, and in his own proper colours, Tom has that knowledge of Mr. Pecksniff." "Why, of course I have," cried Tom. "That's exactly what I have so often said to you. If you knew him as well as I do, John, I'd give almost any money to bring that about. You'd admire, respect, and reverence him. You couldn't help it. Oh, how you wounded his feelings when you went away." "If I had known whereabout his feelings lay," retorted young Westlock, "I'd have done my best, Tom, with that end in view, you may depend upon it. But as I couldn't wound him in what he has not, and in what he knows nothing of, except in his ability to probe them to the quick in other people, I am afraid I can lay no claim to your compliment." Mr. Pinch, being unwilling to protract a discussion which might possibly corrupt Martin, forbore to say anything in reply to this speech. But John Westlock, whom nothing short of an iron gag would have silenced when Mr. Pecksniff's merits were once in question, continued notwithstanding. "His feelings! Oh, he's a tender-hearted man. His feelings! Oh, he's a considerate, conscientious, self-examining, moral vagabond, he is. His feelings! Oh, what's the matter, Tom?" Mr. Pinch was by this time erect upon the hearth rug, buttoning his coat with great energy. "I can't bear it," said Tom, shaking his head. "No, I really cannot. You must excuse me, John. I have a great esteem and friendship for you. I love you very much, and have been perfectly charmed and overjoyed today to find you just the same as ever, but I cannot listen to this." "Why, it's my old way, Tom, and you say yourself that you are glad to find me unchanged." "Not in this respect," said Tom Pinch. "You must excuse me, John. I cannot, really, I will not. It's very wrong. You should be more guarded in your expressions. It was bad enough when you and I used to be alone together, but under existing circumstances I can't endure it, really. No, I cannot, indeed." "You are quite right," exclaimed the other, exchanging looks with Martin. "And I am quite wrong, Tom. I don't know how the deuce we fell on this unlucky theme. I beg your pardon with all my heart." "You have a free and manly temper, I know," said Pinch, "and therefore your being so ungenerous in this one solitary instance only grieves me the more. It's not my pardon you have to ask, John. You have done me nothing but kindnesses." "Well, Pecksniff's pardon, then," said young Westlock. "Anything, Tom, or anybody. Pecksniff's pardon. Will that do? Here, let us drink Pecksniff's health." "Thank you," cried Tom, shaking hands with him eagerly, and filling a bumper. "Thank you. I'll drink it with all my heart, John. Mr. Pecksniff's health, and prosperity to him." John Westlock echoed the sentiment, or nearly so, for he drank Mr. Pecksniff's health and something to him, but what was not quite audible. The general unanimity being then completely restored, they drew their chairs closer round the fire, and conversed in perfect harmony and enjoyment until bedtime. No slight circumstance, perhaps, could have better illustrated the difference of character between John Westlock and Martin Chuzzlewit than the manner in which each of the young men contemplated Tom Pinch after the little rupture just described. There was a certain amount of jocularity in the looks of both, no doubt, but there all resemblance ceased. The old pupil could not do enough to show Tom how cordially he felt towards him, and his friendly regard seemed of a graver and more thoughtful kind than before. The new one, on the other hand, had no impulse but to laugh at the recollection of Tom's extreme absurdity, and mingled with his amusement there was something slighting and contemptuous, indicative, as it appeared, of his opinion that Mr. Pinch was much too far gone in simplicity to be admitted as the friend, on serious and equal terms, of any rational man. John Westlock, who did nothing by halves if he could help it, had provided beds for his two guests in the hotel, and after a very happy evening they retired. Mr. Pinch was sitting on the side of his bed with his cravat and shoes off, ruminating on the manifold good qualities of his old friend, when he was interrupted by a knock at his chamber door, and the voice of John himself. "You're not asleep yet, are you, Tom?" "Bless you, no, not I. I was thinking of you," replied Tom, opening the door. "Come in." "I am not going to detain you," said John, "but I have forgotten all the evening a little commission I took upon myself, and I'm afraid I may forget it again, if I fail to discharge it at once. You know a Mr. Tigg, Tom, I believe?" "Tigg!" cried Tom. "Tigg, the gentleman who borrowed some money of me." "Exactly," said John Westlock. "He begged me to present his compliments, and to return it with many thanks. Here it is. I suppose it's a good one, but he is rather a doubtful kind of customer, Tom." Mr. Pinch received the little piece of gold with a face whose brightness might have shamed the metal, and said he had no fear about that. He was glad, he added, to find Mr. Tigg so prompt and honourable in his dealings, very glad. "Why, to tell you the truth, Tom," replied his friend, "he is not always so. If you'll take my advice, you'll avoid him as much as you can, in the event of your encountering him again, and by no means, Tom, pray bear this in mind, for I am very serious, by no means lend him money any more." "Aye, aye," said Tom, with his eyes wide open. "He is very far from being a reputable acquaintance," returned young Westlock, "and the more you let him know you think so, the better for you, Tom." "I say, John," quoth Mr. Pinch, as his countenance fell, and he shook his head in a dejected manner, "I hope you are not getting into bad company." "No, no," he replied, laughing, "don't be uneasy on that score." "Oh, but I am uneasy," said Tom Pinch. "I can't help it when I hear you talking in that way. If Mr. Tigg is what you describe him to be, you have no business to know him, John. You may laugh, but I don't consider it by any means a laughing matter, I assure you." "No, no," returned his friend, composing his features, "quite right, it is not, certainly." "You know, John," said Mr. Pinch, "your very good nature and kindness of heart make you thoughtless, and you can't be too careful on such a point as this. Upon my word, if I thought you were falling among bad companions, I should be quite wretched, for I know how difficult you would find it to shake them off. I would much rather have lost this money, John, than I would have had it back again on such terms." "I tell you, my dear good old fellow," cried his friend, shaking him to and fro with both hands, and smiling at him with a cheerful open countenance that would have carried conviction to a mind much more suspicious than Tom's, "I tell you there is no danger." "Well," cried Tom, "I am glad to hear it. I am overjoyed to hear it. I am sure there is not, when you say so in that manner. You won't take it ill, John, that I said what I did just now?" "Ill?" said the other, giving his hand a hearty squeeze. "Why, what do you think I am made of? Mr. Tigg and I are not on such an intimate footing that you need be at all uneasy. I give you my solemn assurance of that, Tom. You are quite comfortable now?" "Quite," said Tom. "Then once more, good night." "Good night," cried Tom, "and such pleasant dreams to you as should attend the sleep of the best fellow in the world." "Except Pecksniff," said his friend, stopping at the door for a moment and looking gaily back. "Except Pecksniff," answered Tom, with great gravity, "of course." And thus they parted for the night, John Westlock full of light heartedness and good humour, and poor Tom Pinch quite satisfied, though still, as he turned over on his side in bed, he muttered to himself, "I really do wish, for all that, though, that he wasn't acquainted with Mr. Tigg. They breakfasted together very early next morning, for the two young men desired to get back again in good season, and John Westlock was to return to London by the coach that day. As he had some hours to spare, he bore them company for 3 or 4 miles on their walk, and only parted from them at last in sheer necessity. The parting was an unusually hearty one, not only as between him and Tom Pinch, but on the side of Martin also, who had found in the old pupil a very different sort of person from the milksop he had prepared himself to expect. Young Westlock stopped upon a rising ground when he had gone a little distance, and looked back. They were walking at a brisk pace, and Tom appeared to be talking earnestly. Martin had taken off his greatcoat, the wind being now behind them, and carried it upon his arm. As he looked, he saw Tom relieve him of it, after a faint resistance, and throwing it upon his own, encumber himself with the weight of both. This trivial incident impressed the old pupil mightily, for he stood there gazing after them until they were hidden from his view, when he shook his head, as if he were troubled by some uneasy reflection, and thoughtfully retraced his steps to Salisbury. In the meantime, Martin and Tom pursued their way until they halted safe and sound at Mr. Pecksniff's house, where a brief epistle from that good gentleman to Mr. Pinch announced the family's return by that night's coach. As it would pass the corner of the lane at about 6 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Pecksniff requested that the gig might be in waiting at the finger post about that time, together with a cart for the luggage. And to the end that he might be received with the greater honour, the young men agreed to rise early and be upon the spot themselves. It was the least cheerful day they had yet passed together. Martin was out of spirits and out of humour, and took every opportunity of comparing his condition and prospects with those of young Westlock, much to his own disadvantage always. This mood of his depressed Tom, and neither that morning's party nor yesterday's dinner helped to mend the matter. So the hours dragged on heavily enough, and they were glad to go to bed early. They were not quite so glad to get up again at 4:30 o'clock, in all the shivering discomfort of a dark winter's morning, but they turned out punctually, and were at the finger post full half an hour before the appointed time. It was not by any means a lively morning, for the sky was black and cloudy, and it rained hard, but Martin said there was some satisfaction in seeing that brute of a horse (by this he meant Mr. Pecksniff's Arab steed) getting very wet, and that he rejoiced on his account that it rained so fast. From this it may be inferred that Martin's spirits had not improved, as indeed they had not, for while he and Mr. Pinch stood waiting under a hedge, looking at the rain, the gig, the cart, and its reeking driver, he did nothing but grumble, and but that it is indispensable to any dispute that there should be two parties to it, he would certainly have picked a quarrel with Tom. At length the noise of wheels was faintly audible in the distance, and presently the coach came splashing through the mud and mire, with one miserable outside passenger crouching down among wet straw under a saturated umbrella, and the coachman, guard, and horses in a fellowship of dripping wretchedness. Immediately on its stopping, Mr. Pecksniff let down the window glass and hailed Tom Pinch. "Dear me, Mr. Pinch, is it possible that you are out upon this very inclement morning?" "Yes, sir," cried Tom, advancing eagerly. "Mr. Chuzzlewit and I, sir." "Oh," said Mr. Pecksniff, looking not so much at Martin as at the spot on which he stood. "Oh, indeed. Do me the favour to see to the trunks, if you please, Mr. Pinch." Then Mr. Pecksniff descended and helped his daughters to alight. But neither he nor the young ladies took the slightest notice of Martin, who had advanced to offer his assistance, but was repulsed by Mr. Pecksniff's standing immediately before his person, with his back towards him. In the same manner, and in profound silence, Mr. Pecksniff handed his daughters into the gig, and following himself and taking the reins, drove off home. Lost in astonishment, Martin stood staring at the coach, and when the coach had driven away, at Mr. Pinch and the luggage, until the cart moved off too, when he said to Tom, "Now will you have the goodness to tell me what this portends?" "What?" asked Tom. "This fellow's behaviour. Mr. Pecksniff's, I mean. You saw it." "No, indeed I did not," cried Tom. "I was busy with the trunks." "It is no matter," said Martin. "Come, let us make haste back," and without another word started off at such a pace that Tom had some difficulty in keeping up with him. He had no care where he went, but walked through little heaps of mud and little pools of water with the utmost indifference, looking straight before him and sometimes laughing in a strange manner within himself. Tom felt that anything he could say would only render him the more obstinate, and therefore trusted to Mr. Pecksniff's manner when they reached the house to remove the mistaken impression under which he felt convinced so great a favourite as the new pupil must unquestionably be labouring. But he was not a little amazed himself when they did reach it, and entered the parlour where Mr. Pecksniff was sitting alone before the fire, drinking some hot tea, to find that instead of taking favourable notice of his relative and keeping him, Mr. Pinch, in the background, he did exactly the reverse, and was so lavish in his attentions to Tom that Tom was thoroughly confounded. "Take some tea, Mr. Pinch, take some tea," said Pecksniff, stirring the fire. "You must be very cold and damp. Pray take some tea, and come into a warm place, Mr. Pinch." Tom saw that Martin looked at Mr. Pecksniff as though he could have easily found it in his heart to give him an invitation to a very warm place, but he was quite silent, and standing opposite that gentleman at the table, regarded him attentively. "Take a chair, Pinch," said Pecksniff. "Take a chair, if you please. How have things gone on in our absence, Mr. Pinch?" You will be very much pleased with the grammar school, sir," said Tom. "It's nearly finished." "If you will have the goodness, Mr. Pinch," said Pecksniff, waving his hand and smiling. "We will not discuss anything connected with that question at present. What have you been doing, Thomas, Mr. Pinch looked from master to pupil, and from pupil to master, and was so perplexed and dismayed that he wanted presence of mind to answer the question. In this awkward interval, Mr. Pecksniff, who was perfectly conscious of Martin's gaze, though he had never once glanced towards him, poked the fire very much, and when he couldn't do that any more, drank tea assiduously. "Now, Mr. Pecksniff," said Martin at last, in a very quiet voice, "if you have sufficiently refreshed and recovered yourself, I shall be glad to hear what you mean by this treatment of me." "And what?" said Mr. Pecksniff, turning his eyes on Tom Pinch, even more placidly and gently than before. "What have you been doing, Thomas, When he had repeated this inquiry, he looked round the walls of the room as if he were curious to see whether any nails had been left there by accident in former times. Tom was almost at his wits' end what to say between the two, and had already made a gesture as if he would call Mr. Pecksniff's attention to the gentleman who had last addressed him, when Martin saved him further trouble by doing so himself. "Mr. Pecksniff," he said, softly rapping the table twice or thrice, and moving a step or two nearer, so that he could have touched him with his hand, "you heard what I said just now. Do me the favour to reply, if you please. I ask you," he raised his voice a little here, "what you mean by this?" "I will talk to you, sir," said Mr. Pecksniff in a severe voice, as he looked at him for the first time, "presently." "You are very obliging," returned Martin. "Presently will not do. I must trouble you to talk to me at once." Mr. Pecksniff made a feint of being deeply interested in his pocket book, but it shook in his hands, he trembled so. "Now," retorted Martin, rapping the table again. "Now. Presently will not do. Now." "Do you threaten me, sir?" cried Mr. Pecksniff. Martin looked at him and made no answer, but a curious observer might have detected an ominous twitching at his mouth, and perhaps an involuntary attraction of his right hand in the direction of Mr. Pecksniff's cravat. "I lament to be obliged to say, sir," resumed Mr. Pecksniff, "that it would be quite in keeping with your character if you did threaten me. You have deceived me. You have imposed upon a nature which you knew to be confiding and unsuspicious. You have obtained admission, sir," said Mr. Pecksniff, rising, "to this house on perverted statements and on false pretences." "Go on," said Martin, with a scornful smile. "I understand you now. What more?" "Thus much more, sir," cried Mr. Pecksniff, trembling from head to foot, and trying to rub his hands as though he were only cold. "Thus much more. If you force me to publish your shame before a third party, which I was unwilling and indisposed to do, this lowly roof, sir, must not be contaminated by the presence of one who has deceived and cruelly deceived an honourable, beloved, venerated, and venerable gentleman, and who wisely suppressed that deceit from me when he sought my protection and favour, knowing that, humble as I am an honest man seeking to do my duty in this carnal universe, and setting my face against all vice and treachery. I weep for your depravity, sir, said Mr. Pecksniff. I mourn over your corruption. I pity your voluntary withdrawal of yourself from the flowery paths of purity and peace. Here he struck himself upon his breast, or moral garden. But I cannot have a leper and a serpent for an inmate. Go forth, said Mr. Pecksniff, stretching out his hand. Go forth, young man. Like all who know you, I renounce you. With what intention Martin made a stride forward at these words, it is impossible to say. It is enough to know that Tom Pinch caught him in his arms, and that at the same moment Mr. Pecksniff stepped back so hastily that he missed his footing, tumbled over a chair, and fell in a sitting posture on the ground, where he remained without an effort to get up again, with his head in a corner, perhaps considering it the safest place. "Let me go, Pinch," cried Martin, shaking him away. "Why do you hold me? Do you think a blow could make him a more abject creature than he is? Do you think that if I spat upon him I could degrade him to a lower level than his own? Look at him, Pinch." Mr. Pinch involuntarily did so. Mr. Pecksniff, sitting, as has been already mentioned, on the carpet, with his head in an acute angle of the wainscot, and all the damage and detriment of an uncomfortable journey about him, was not exactly a model of all that is prepossessing and dignified in man, certainly. Still, he was Pecksniff. It was impossible to deprive him of that unique and paramount appeal to Tom, and he returned Tom's glance as if he would have said, "Ay, Mr. Pinch, look at me. Here I am. You know what the poet says about an honest man, and an honest man is one of the few great works that can be seen for nothing. Look at me." "I tell you," said Martin, "that as he lies there disgraced, bought, used, a cloth for dirty hands, a mat for dirty feet, a lying, fawning, servile hound, he is the very last and worst among the vermin of the world. And mark me, Pinch, the day will come, he knows it, see it written on his face while I speak, when even you will find him out, and will know him as I do, and as he knows I do. He renounce me? Cast your eyes on the renouncer, Pinch, and be the wiser for the recollection." He pointed at him as he spoke with unutterable contempt, and flinging his hat upon his head, walked from the room and from the house. He went so rapidly that he was already clear of the village when he heard Tom Pinch calling breathlessly after him in the distance. "Well, what now?" he said, when Tom came up. "Dear, dear!" cried Tom. "Are you going?" "Going?" he echoed. "Going? I didn't so much mean that as were you going now at once, in this bad weather, on foot, without your clothes, with no money?" cried Tom. "Yes," he answered sternly, "I am." "And where?" cried Tom. "Oh, where will you go?" "I don't know," he said. "Yes, I do. I'll go to America." "No, no!" cried Tom, in a kind of agony. "Don't go there. Pray don't. Think better of it. Don't be so dreadfully regardless of yourself. Don't go to America." "My mind is made up," he said. "Your friend was right. I'll go to America. God bless you, Pinch." "Take this," cried Tom, pressing a book upon him in great agitation. "I must make haste back, and I can't say anything I would. Heaven be with you. Look at the leaf I have turned down. Good-bye, good-bye." The simple fellow wrung him by the hand, with tears stealing down his cheeks, and they parted hurriedly upon their separate ways. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13, Part 1 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 13. Showing what became of Martin and his desperate resolve after he left Mr. Pecksniff's house, what persons he encountered, what anxieties he suffered, and what news he heard. Part 1. Carrying Tom Pinch's book quite unconsciously under his arm, and not even buttoning his coat as a protection against the heavy rain, Martin went doggedly forward at the same quick pace until he had passed the finger post and was on the high road to London. He slackened very little in his speed even then, but he began to think and look about him, and to disengage his senses from the coil of angry passions which hitherto had held them prisoner. It must be confessed that at that moment he had no very agreeable employment either for his moral or his physical perceptions. The day was dawning from a patch of watery light in the east, and sullen clouds came driving up before it, from which the rain descended in a thick wet mist. It streamed from every twig and bramble in the hedge, made little gullies in the path, ran down 100 channels in the road, and punched innumerable holes into the face of every pond and gutter. It fell with an oozy, slushy sound among the grass, and made a muddy kennel of every furrow in the ploughed fields. No living creature was anywhere to be seen. The prospect could hardly have been more desolate if animated nature had been dissolved in water and poured down upon the earth again in that form. The range of view within the solitary traveller was quite as cheerless as the scene without. Friendless and penniless, incensed to the last degree, deeply wounded in his pride and self-love, full of independent schemes, and perfectly destitute of any means of realizing them, his most vindictive enemy might have been satisfied with the extent of his troubles. To add to his other miseries, he was by this time sensible of being wet to the skin and cold at his very heart. In this deplorable condition he remembered Mr. Pinch's book, more because it was rather troublesome to carry than from any hope of being comforted by that parting gift. He looked at the dingy lettering on the back, and finding it to be an odd volume of the Bachelor of Salamanca in the French tongue, cursed Tom Pinch's folly 20 times. He was on the point of throwing it away in his ill humour and vexation, when he bethought himself that Tom had referred him to a leaf turned down, and opening it at that place, that he might have additional cause of complaint against him for supposing that any cold scrap of the bachelor's wisdom could cheer him in such circumstances, found, well, well, not much, but Tom's all, the half-sovereign. He had wrapped it hastily in a piece of paper and pinned it to the leaf. These words were scrawled in pencil on the inside: "I don't want it, indeed. I should not know what to do with it if I had it." There are some falsehoods, Tom, on which men mount as on bright wings towards heaven. There are some truths, cold, bitter, taunting truths, wherein your worldly scholars are very apt and punctual, which bind men down to earth with leaden chains. Who would not rather have to fan him, in his dying hour, the lightest feather of a falsehood such as thine, than all the quills that have been plucked from the sharp porcupine, reproachful truth, since time began? Martin felt keenly for himself, and he felt this good deed of Tom's keenly. After a few minutes it had the effect of raising his spirits, and reminding him that he was not altogether destitute, as he had left a fair stock of clothes behind him, and wore a gold hunting watch in his pocket. He found a curious gratification, too, in thinking what a winning fellow he must be to have made such an impression on Tom, and in reflecting how superior he was to Tom, and how much more likely to make his way in the world. Animated by these thoughts, and strengthened in his design of endeavouring to push his fortune in another country, he resolved to get to London as a rallying point, in the best way he could, and to lose no time about it. He was 10 good miles from the village made illustrious by being the abiding place of Mr. Pecksniff, when he stopped to breakfast at a little roadside alehouse, and resting upon a high-backed settle before the fire, pulled off his coat and hung it before the cheerful blaze to dry. It was a very different place from the last tavern in which he had regaled, boasting no greater extent of accommodation than the brick-floored kitchen yielded. But the mind so soon accommodates itself to the necessities of the body, that this poor waggoner's house of call, which he would have despised yesterday, became now quite a choice hotel, while his dish of eggs and bacon and his mug of beer were not by any means the coarse fare he had supposed, but fully bore out the inscription on the window shutter, which proclaimed those viands to be good entertainment for travellers. He pushed away his empty plate, and with a second mug upon the hearth before him, looked thoughtfully at the fire until his eyes ached. Then he looked at the highly coloured scripture pieces on the walls, in little black frames like common shaving glasses, and saw how the wise men, with a strong family likeness among them, worshipped in a pink manger, and how the prodigal son came home in red rags to a purple father, and already feasted his imagination on a sea-green calf. Then he glanced through the window at the falling rain coming down aslant upon the signpost over against the house, and overflowing the horse trough, and then he looked at the fire again, and seemed to descry a double distant London, retreating among the fragments of the burning wood. He had repeated this process in just the same order many times, as if it were a matter of necessity, when the sound of wheels called his attention to the window out of its regular turn, and there he beheld a kind of light van drawn by 4 horses, and laden, as well as he could see, for it was covered in, with corn and straw. The driver, who was alone, stopped at the door to water his team, and presently came stamping and shaking the wet off his hat and coat into the room where Martin sat. He was a red-faced, burly young fellow, smart in his way, and with a good-humoured countenance. As he advanced towards the fire, he touched his shining forehead with the forefinger of his stiff leather glove by way of salutation, and said, rather unnecessarily, that it was an uncommon wet day. "Very wet," said Martin. "I don't know as ever I see a wetter." "I never felt one," said Martin. The driver glanced at Martin's soiled dress and his damp shirt sleeves and his coat hung up to dry, and said, after a pause, as he warmed his hands, "You have been caught in it, sir?" "Yes," was the short reply. "Out riding, maybe?" said the driver. "I should have been if I owned a horse, but I don't," returned Martin. "That's bad," said the driver. "And maybe worse," said Martin. Now the driver said that's bad, not so much because Martin didn't own a horse, as because he said he didn't, with all the reckless desperation of his mood and circumstances, and so left a great deal to be inferred. Martin put his hands in his pockets and whistled when he had retorted on the driver, thus giving him to understand that he didn't care a pin for fortune, that he was above pretending to be her favourite when he was not, and that he snapped his fingers at her, the driver, and everybody else. The driver looked at him stealthily for a minute or so, and in the pauses of his warming whistled too. At length he asked, as he pointed his thumb towards the road, "Up or down?" "Which is up?" said Martin. "London, of course," said the driver. "Up, then," said Martin. He tossed his head in a careless manner afterwards, as if he would have added, "Now you know all about it," put his hands deeper into his pockets, changed his tune, and whistled a little louder. "I'm going up," observed the driver. "Hounslow, 10 miles this side London." "Are you?" cried Martin, stopping short and looking at him. The driver sprinkled the fire with his wet hat until it hissed again, and answered, "Aye, to be sure he was." "Why then," said Martin, "I'll be plain with you. You may suppose from my dress that I have money to spare. I have not. All I can afford for coach hire is a crown, for I have but 2. If you can take me for that, and my waistcoat, or this silk handkerchief, do. If you can't, leave it alone." "Short and sweet," remarked the driver. "You want more?" said Martin. "Then I haven't got more, and I can't get it, so there's an end of that." Whereupon he began to whistle again. "I didn't say I wanted more, did I?" asked the driver with something like indignation. "You didn't say my offer was enough," rejoined Martin. "Why, how could I, when you wouldn't let me? In regard to the waistcoat, I wouldn't have a man's waistcoat, much less a gentleman's waistcoat, on my mind for no consideration. But the silk handkerchief's another thing, and if you was satisfied when we got to Hounslow, I shouldn't object to that as a gift." "Is it a bargain, then?" said Martin. "Yes, it is," returned the other. "Then finish this beer," said Martin, handing him the mug and pulling on his coat with great alacrity, "and let us be off as soon as you like." In 2 minutes more he had paid his bill, which amounted to a shilling, was lying at full length on a truss of straw, high and dry, at the top of the van, with the tilt a little open in front for the convenience of talking to his new friend, and was moving along in the right direction with a most satisfactory and encouraging briskness. The driver's name, as he soon informed Martin, was William Simmons, better known as Bill, and his spruce appearance was sufficiently explained by his connection with a large stage coaching establishment at Hounslow, whither he was conveying his load from a farm belonging to the concern in Wiltshire. He was frequently up and down the road on such errands, he said, and to look after the sick and rest horses, of which animals he had much to relate that occupied a long time in the telling. He aspired to the dignity of the regular box, and expected an appointment on the first vacancy. He was musical besides, and had a little key bugle in his pocket, on which, whenever the conversation flagged, he played the first part of a great many tunes, and regularly broke down in the second. "Ah," said Bill with a sigh, as he drew the back of his hand across his lips, and put this instrument in his pocket, after screwing off the mouthpiece to drain it. "Lummy Ned of the Light Salisbury, he was the one for musical talents. He was a guard. What you may call a garden angel was Ned." "Is he dead?" asked Martin. "Dead?" replied the other with a contemptuous emphasis. "Not he. You won't catch Ned a dying easy. No, no, he knows better than that." "You spoke of him in the past tense," observed Martin, "so I supposed he was no more." "He's no more in England," said Bill, "if that's what you mean. He went to the United States." "Did he?" asked Martin with sudden interest. "When?" 5 year ago, or then about," said Bill. "He had set up in the public line here, and couldn't meet his engagements, so he cut off to Liverpool one day without saying anything about it, and went and shipped himself for the United States." "Well," said Martin. "Well, as he landed there without a penny to bless himself with, of course they was very glad to see him in the United States." "What do you mean?" asked Martin with some scorn. "What do I mean?" said Bill. "Why, that. All men are alike in the United States, ain't they? It makes no odds whether a man has £1,000 or nothing, there. Particular in New York, I'm told, where Ned landed." "New York, was it?" asked Martin thoughtfully. "Yes," said Bill, "New York. I know that, because he sent word home that it brought old York to his mind, quite vivid, in consequence of being so exactly unlike it in every respect. I don't understand what particular business Ned turned his mind to when he got there, but he wrote home that him and his friends was always a singing 'Ale Columbia' and blowing up the president, so I suppose it was something in the public line, or free and easy way again. Anyhow, he made his fortune." "No!" cried Martin. "Yes, he did," said Bill. "I know that, because he lost it all the day after, and 26 banks is broke. He settled a lot of the notes on his father when it was ascertained that they was really stopped, and sent 'em over with a dutiful letter. I know that, because they was shown down our yard for the old gentleman's benefit, that he might treat himself with tobacco in the workus." "He was a foolish fellow not to take care of his money when he had it," said Martin indignantly. "There you're right," said Bill, "especially as it was all in paper, and he might have took care of it so very easy by folding it up in a small parcel." Martin said nothing in reply, but soon afterwards fell asleep, and remained so for an hour or more. When he awoke, finding it had ceased to rain, he took his seat beside the driver, and asked him several questions, as how long had the fortunate guard of the Light Salisbury been in crossing the Atlantic, at what time of the year had he sailed, what was the name of the ship in which he made the voyage, how much had he paid for passage money, did he suffer greatly from seasickness, and so forth. But on these points of detail his friend was possessed of little or no information, either answering obviously at random, or acknowledging that he had never heard, or had forgotten. Nor, although he returned to the charge very often, could he obtain any useful intelligence on these essential particulars. They jogged on all day, and stopped so often, now to refresh, now to change their team of horses, now to exchange or bring away a set of harness, now on one point of business and now upon another, connected with the coaching on that line of road, that it was midnight when they reached Hounslow. A little short of the stables for which the van was bound, Martin got down, paid his crown, and forced his silk handkerchief upon his honest friend, notwithstanding the many protestations that he didn't wish to deprive him of it, with which he tried to give the lie to his longing looks. That done, they parted company, and when the van had driven into its own yard and the gates were closed, Martin stood in the dark street with a pretty strong sense of being shut out alone upon the dreary world without the key of it. But in this moment of despondency, and often afterwards, the recollection of Mr. Pecksniff operated as a cordial to him, awakening in his breast an indignation that was very wholesome in nerving him to obstinate endurance. Under the influence of this fiery dram, he started off for London without more ado, arriving there in the middle of the night, and not knowing where to find a tavern open, he was fain to stroll about the streets and market-places until morning. He found himself about an hour before dawn in the humbler regions of the Adelphi, and addressing himself to a man in a fur cap, who was taking down the shutters of an obscure public house, informed him that he was a stranger, and inquired if he could have a bed there. It happened, by good luck, that he could. Though none of the gaudiest, it was tolerably clean, and Martin felt very glad and grateful when he crept into it, for warmth, rest, and forgetfulness. It was quite late in the afternoon when he awoke, and by the time he had washed and dressed and broken his fast, it was growing dusk again. This was all the better, for it was now a matter of absolute necessity that he should part with his watch to some obliging pawnbroker. He would have waited until after dark for this purpose, though it had been the longest day in the year, and he had begun it without a breakfast. He passed more golden balls than all the jugglers in Europe have juggled with, in the course of their united performances, before he could determine in favour of any particular shop where those symbols were displayed. In the end he came back to one of the first he had seen, and entering by a side door in a court where the 3 balls with the legend "Money Lent" were repeated in a ghastly transparency, passed into one of a series of little closets or private boxes erected for the accommodation of the more bashful and uninitiated customers. He bolted himself in, pulled out his watch, and laid it on the counter. "Upon my life and soul," said a low voice in the next box to the shopman who was in treaty with him, "you must make it more. You must make it a trifle more, you must indeed. You must dispense with 1/2 of an ounce in weighing out your pound of flesh, my best of friends, and make it 2 6." Martin drew back involuntarily, for he knew the voice at once. "You're always full of your chaff," said the shopman, rolling up the article, which looked like a shirt, quite as a matter of course, and nibbing his pen upon the counter. "I shall never be full of my wheat," said Mr. Tigg, "as long as I come here. Ha, ha, not bad. Make it 2 6, my dear friend, positively, for this occasion only. 1/2 a crown is a delightful coin. 2 6, going at 2 6, for the last time, at 2 6. "It'll never be the last time till it's quite worn out," rejoined the shopman. "It's grown yellow in the service as it is." "Its master has grown yellow in the service, if you mean that, my friend," said Mr. Tigg. "In the patriotic service of an ungrateful country. You are making it 2 6, I think." "I'm making it," returned the shopman, "what it always has been, 2 shillings. Same name as usual, I suppose?" "Still the same name," said Mr. Tigg, "my claim to the dormant peerage not being yet established by the House of Lords." "The old address?" "Not at all," said Mr. Tigg. "I have removed my town establishment from 38 Mayfair to number 1542 Park Lane." "Come, I'm not going to put down that, you know," said the shopman with a grin. "You may put down what you please, my friend," quoth Mr. Tigg. "The fact is still the same. The apartments for the under butler and the 5th footman being of a most confounded low and vulgar kind at 38 Mayfair, I have been compelled, in my regard for the feelings which do them so much honour, to take on lease for 7, 14, or 21 years, renewable at the option of the tenant, the elegant and commodious family mansion, number 1542 Park Lane. Make it 2 and 6, and come and see me." The shopman was so highly entertained by this piece of humour that Mr. Tigg himself could not repress some little show of exultation. It vented itself in part in a desire to see how the occupant of the next box received his pleasantry, to ascertain which he glanced round the partition, and immediately by the gaslight recognized Martin. "I wish I may die," said Mr. Tigg, stretching out his body so far that his head was as much in Martin's little cell as Martin's own head was, "but this is one of the most tremendous meetings in ancient or modern history. How are you? What is the news from the agricultural districts? How are our friends the peas? Ha, ha! David, pay particular attention to this gentleman immediately, as a friend of mine, I beg. Here, please to give me the most you can for this," said Martin, handing the watch to the shopman. "I want money sorely." "He wants money sorely," cried Mr. Tigg, with excessive sympathy. "David, will you have the goodness to do your very utmost for my friend who wants money sorely? You will deal with my friend as if he were myself. A gold hunting watch, David, engine turned, capped and jewelled in 4 holes, escape movement, horizontal lever, and warranted to perform correctly upon my personal reputation, who have observed it narrowly for many years under the most trying circumstances." Here he winked at Martin, that he might understand this recommendation would have an immense effect upon the shopman. "What do you say, David, to my friend? Be very particular to deserve my custom and recommendation, David." "I can lend you £3 on this if you like," said the shopman to Martin, confidentially. "It is very old fashioned. I couldn't say more." "And devilish handsome too," cried Mr. Tigg. 2 12 6 for the watch, and 7 and 6 for personal regard. I am gratified. It may be weakness, but I am. £3 will do. We take it. The name of my friend is Smivey, Chicken Smivey of Holborn, 26 1/2 B lodger." Here he winked at Martin again, to apprise him that all the forms and ceremonies prescribed by law were now complied with, and nothing remained but the receipt for the money. In point of fact, this proved to be the case, for Martin, who had no resource but to take what was offered him, signified his acquiescence by a nod of his head, and presently came out with the cash in his pocket. He was joined in the entry by Mr. Tigg, who warmly congratulated him, as he took his arm and accompanied him into the street, on the successful issue of the negotiation. "As for my part in the same," said Mr. Tigg, "don't mention it. Don't compliment me, for I can't bear it." "I have no such intention, I assure you," retorted Martin, releasing his arm and stopping. "You oblige me very much," said Mr. Tigg. "Thank you." "Now, sir," observed Martin, biting his lip, "this is a large town, and we can easily find different ways in it. If you will show me which is your way, I will take another." Mr. Tigg was about to speak, but Martin interposed. "I need scarcely tell you, after what you have just seen, that I have nothing to bestow upon your friend Mr. Slime, and it is quite as unnecessary for me to tell you that I don't desire the honour of your company." "Stop!" cried Mr. Tigg, holding out his hand. "Hold! There is a most remarkably long-headed, flowing-bearded, and patriarchal proverb which observes that it is the duty of a man to be just before he is generous. Be just now, and you can be generous presently. Do not confuse me with the man Slime. Do not distinguish the man Slime as a friend of mine, for he is no such thing. I have been compelled, sir, to abandon the party whom you call Slime." "I have no knowledge of the party whom you call Slime. I am, sir," said Mr. Tigg, striking himself upon the breast, "a premium tulip of a very different growth and cultivation from the cabbage Slime, sir." "It matters very little to me," said Martin coolly, "whether you have set up as a vagabond on your own account, or are still trading on behalf of Mr. Slime. I wish to hold no correspondence with you. In the devil's name, man," said Martin, scarcely able, despite his vexation, to repress a smile, as Mr. Tigg stood leaning his back against the shutters of a shop window, adjusting his hair with great composure. Will you go one way or other?" "You will allow me to remind you, sir," said Mr. Tigg with sudden dignity, "that you, not I, that you, I say emphatically you, have reduced the proceedings of this evening to a cold and distant matter of business, when I was disposed to place them on a friendly footing. It being made a matter of business, sir, I beg to say that I expect a trifle, which I shall bestow in charity, as commission upon the pecuniary advance, in which I have rendered you my humble services. After the terms in which you have addressed me, sir," concluded Mr. Tigg, "you will not insult me, if you please, by offering more than half a crown." Martin drew that piece of money from his pocket and tossed it towards him. Mr. Tigg caught it, looked at it to assure himself of its goodness, spun it in the air after the manner of a pieman, and buttoned it up. Finally he raised his hat an inch or two from his head, with a military air, and after pausing a moment with deep gravity, as to decide in which direction he should go, and to what earl or marquis among his friends he should give the preference in his next call, stuck his hands in his skirt pockets, and swaggered round the corner. Martin took the directly opposite course, and so, to his great content, they parted company. Chapter 13 Part 2 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 13 Part 2. It was with a bitter sense of humiliation that he cursed, again and again, the mischance of having encountered this man in the pawnbroker's shop. The only comfort he had in the recollection was Mr. Tigg's voluntary avowal of a separation between himself and Slime that would at least prevent his circumstances, so Martin argued, from being known to any member of his family, the bare possibility of which filled him with shame and wounded pride. Abstractedly, there was greater reason, perhaps, for supposing any declaration of Mr. Tigg's to be false, than for attaching the least credence to it. But remembering the terms on which the intimacy between that gentleman and his bosom friend had subsisted, and the strong probability of Mr. Tigg's having established an independent business of his own on Mr. Slime's connection, it had a reasonable appearance of probability. At all events, Martin hoped so, and that went a long way. His first step, now that he had a supply of ready money for his present necessities, was to retain his bed at the public house until further notice, and to write a formal note to Tom Pinch, for he knew Pecksniff would see it, requesting to have his clothes forwarded to London by coach, with a direction to be left at the office until called for. These measures taken, he passed the interval before the box arrived, 3 days, in making inquiries relative to American vessels at the offices of various shipping agents in the city, and in lingering about the docks and wharves with the faint hope of stumbling upon some engagement for the voyage as clerk or supercargo or custodian of something or somebody which would enable him to procure a free passage. But finding soon that no such means of employment were likely to present themselves, and dreading the consequences of delay, he drew up a short advertisement stating what he wanted, and inserted it in the leading newspapers. Pending the receipt of the 20 or 30 answers which he vaguely expected, he reduced his wardrobe to the narrowest limits consistent with decent respectability, and carried the overplus at different times to the pawnbroker's shop for conversion into money. And it was strange, very strange, even to himself, to find how, by quick though almost imperceptible degrees, he lost his delicacy and self-respect, and gradually came to do that, as a matter of course, without the least compunction, which but a few short days before had galled him to the quick. The first time he visited the pawnbrokers, he felt on his way there as if every person whom he passed suspected whither he was going, and on his way back again, as if the whole human tide he stemmed knew well where he had come from. When did he care to think of their discernment now? In his first wanderings up and down the weary streets he counterfeited the walk of one who had an object in his view, but soon there came upon him the sauntering slipshod gait of listless idleness, and the lounging at street corners, and plucking and biting of stray bits of straw, and strolling up and down the same place, and looking into the same shop windows, with a miserable indifference 50 times a day. At first he came out from his lodging with an uneasy sense of being observed, even by those chance passers-by on whom he had never looked before, and hundreds to one would never see again, issuing in the morning from a public-house. But now, in his comings out and goings in, he did not mind to lounge about the door, or to stand sunning himself in careless thought beside the wooden stem, studded from head to heel with pegs, on which the beer pots dangled like so many boughs upon a pewter tree. And yet it took but 5 weeks to reach the lowest round of this tall ladder. O moralists, who treat of happiness and self-respect innate in every sphere of life, and shedding light on every grain of dust in God's highway, so smooth below your carriage wheels, so rough beneath the tread of naked feet, bethink yourselves, in looking on the swift descent of men who have lived in their own esteem, that there are scores of thousands breathing now, and breathing thick with painful toil, who in that high respect have never lived at all, nor had a chance of life. Go ye, who rest so placidly upon the sacred bard, who had been young, and when he strung his harp was old, and had never seen the righteous forsaken, or his seed begging their bread. Go, teachers of content and honest pride, into the mine, the mill, the forge, the squalid depths of deepest ignorance, and uttermost abyss of man's neglect. And say, can any hopeful plant spring up in air so foul that it extinguishes the soul's bright torch as fast as it is kindled? And O ye Pharisees of the 1900th year of Christian knowledge, who soundingly appeal to human nature, see that it be human first. Take heed it has not been transformed during your slumber and the sleep of generations into the nature of the beasts. 5 weeks! Of all the 20 or 30 answers, not one had come. His money, even the additional stock he had raised from the disposal of his spare clothes, and that was not much, for clothes, though dear to buy, are cheap to pawn, was fast diminishing. Yet what could he do? At times an agony came over him, in which he darted forth again, though he was but newly home, and returning to some place where he had been already 20 times, made some new attempt to gain his end, but always unsuccessfully. He was years and years too old for a cabin boy, and years upon years too inexperienced to be accepted as a common seaman. His dress and manner, too, militated fatally against any such proposal as the latter, and yet he was reduced to making it, for even if he could have contemplated the being set down in America totally without money, he had not enough left now for a steerage passage and the poorest provisions upon the voyage. It is an illustration of a very common tendency in the mind of man, that all this time he never once doubted, one may almost say the certainty of doing great things in the New World, if he could only get there. In proportion as he became more and more dejected by his present circumstances, and the means of gaining America receded from his grasp, the more he fretted himself with the conviction that that was the only place in which he could hope to achieve any high end, and worried his brain with the thought that men going there in the meanwhile might anticipate him in the attainment of those objects which were dearest to his heart. He often thought of John Westlock, and besides looking out for him on all occasions, actually walked about London for 3 days together for the express purpose of meeting with him. But although he failed in this, and although he would not have scrupled to borrow money of him, and although he believed that John would have lent it, yet still he could not bring his mind to write to Pinch and inquire where he was to be found. For although, as we have seen, he was fond of Tom after his own fashion, he could not endure the thought, feeling so superior to Tom, of making him the stepping stone to his fortune, or being anything to him but a patron, and his pride so revolted from the idea that it restrained him even now. It might have yielded, however, and no doubt must have yielded soon, but for a very strange and unlooked for occurrence. The 5 weeks had quite run out, and he was in a truly desperate plight, when one evening, having just returned to his lodging, and being in the act of lighting his candle at the gas jet in the bar, before stalking moodily upstairs to his own room, his landlord called him by his name. Now, as he had never told it to the man, but had scrupulously kept it to himself, he was not a little startled by this, and so plainly showed his agitation that the landlord, to reassure him, said it was only a letter. "A letter?" cried Martin. "From Mr. Martin Chuzzlewit," said the landlord, reading the superscription of one he held in his hand. "Noon, chief office, paid." Martin took it from him, thanked him, and walked upstairs. It was not sealed, but pasted close. The handwriting was quite unknown to him. He opened it, and found enclosed, without any name, address, or other inscription or explanation of any kind whatever, a Bank of England note for £20. To say that he was perfectly stunned with astonishment and delight, that he looked again and again at the note and the wrapper, that he hurried below stairs to make quite certain that the note was a good note, and then hurried up again to satisfy himself for the 50th time that he had not overlooked some scrap of writing on the wrapper, that he exhausted and bewildered himself with conjectures, and could make nothing of it, but that there the note was, and he was suddenly enriched, would be only to relate so many matters of course to no purpose. The final upshot of the business at that time was, that he resolved to treat himself to a comfortable but frugal meal in his own chamber, and having ordered a fire to be kindled, went out to purchase it forthwith. He bought some cold beef, and ham, and French bread, and butter, and came back with his pockets pretty heavily laden. It was somewhat of a damping circumstance to find the room full of smoke, which was attributable to two causes: firstly, to the flue being naturally vicious and a smoker, and secondly, to their having forgotten, in lighting the fire, an odd sack or two, and some trifles which had been put up the chimney to keep the rain out. They had already remedied this oversight, however, and propped up the window sash with a bundle of firewood to keep it open, so that, except in being rather inflammatory to the eyes and choking to the lungs, the apartment was quite comfortable. Martin was in no vein to quarrel with it, if it had been in less tolerable order, especially when a gleaming pint of porter was set upon the table, and the servant girl withdrew, bearing with her particular instructions relative to the production of something hot when he should ring the bell. The cold meat being wrapped in a playbill, Martin laid the cloth by spreading that document on the little round table with the print downwards, and arranging the collation upon it. The foot of the bed, which was very close to the fire, answered for a sideboard, and when he had completed these preparations, he squeezed an old armchair into the warmest corner, and sat down to enjoy himself. He had begun to eat with great appetite, glancing round the room meanwhile with a triumphant anticipation of quitting it for ever on the morrow, when his attention was arrested by a stealthy footstep on the stairs, and presently by a knock at his chamber door, which, although it was a gentle knock enough, communicated such a start to the bundle of firewood that it instantly leaped out of window and plunged into the street. "More coals, I suppose," said Martin. "Come in." "It an't a liberty, sir, though it seems so," rejoined a man's voice. "Your servant, sir. Hope you're pretty well, sir." Martin stared at the face that was bowing in the doorway, perfectly remembering the features and expression, but quite forgetting to whom they belonged. "Tapley, sir," said his visitor. "Him as formerly lived at the Dragon, sir, and was forced to leave in consequence of a want of jollity, sir." "To be sure," cried Martin. "Why, how did you come here?" "Right through the passage and up the stairs, sir," said Mark. "How did you find me out, I mean?" asked Martin. "Why, sir," said Mark, "I've passed you once or twice in the street, if I'm not mistaken, and when I was a looking in at the beef and ham shop just now, along with a hungry sweep, as was very much calculated to make a man jolly, sir, I see you a buying that." Martin reddened as he pointed to the table, and said somewhat hastily, "Well, what then?" "Why then, sir," said Mark, I made bold to foller, and as I told him downstairs that you expected me, I was let up." "Are you charged with any message that you told them you were expected?" inquired Martin. "No, sir, I ain't," said Mark. "That was what you may call a pious fraud, sir, that was." Martin cast an angry look at him, but there was something in the fellow's merry face and in his manner which, with all its cheerfulness, was far from being obtrusive or familiar, that quite disarmed him. He had lived a solitary life, too, for many weeks, and the voice was pleasant in his ear. "Tapley," he said, "I'll deal openly with you. From all I can judge, and from all I have heard of you through Pinch, you are not a likely kind of fellow to have been brought here by impertinent curiosity or any other offensive motive. Sit down. I'm glad to see you." "Thank'ee, sir," said Mark. "I'd as lieve stand." "If you don't sit down," retorted Martin, "I'll not talk to you." "Very good, sir," observed Mark. "Your will's a law, sir. Down it is." And he sat down accordingly upon the bedstead. "Help yourself," said Martin, handing him the only knife. "Thank'ee, sir," rejoined Mark. "After you've done." "If you don't take it now, you'll not have any," said Martin. "Very good, sir," rejoined Mark. "That being your desire, now it is." With which reply he gravely helped himself, and went on eating. Martin, having done the like for a short time in silence, said abruptly, "What are you doing in London?" "Nothing at all, sir," rejoined Mark. "How's that?" asked Martin. "I want a place," said Mark. "I'm sorry for you," said Martin. "To attend upon a single gentleman," resumed Mark, "if from the country the more desirable. Makeshifts would be preferred. Wages no object." He said this so pointedly that Martin stopped in his eating and said, "If you mean me—" "Yes, I do, sir," interposed Mark. "Then you may judge from my style of living here, of my means of keeping a manservant. Besides, I am going to America immediately." "Well, sir," returned Mark, quite unmoved by this intelligence, "from all that ever I heard about it, I should say America is a very likely sort of place for me to be jolly in." Again Martin looked at him angrily, and again his anger melted away in spite of himself. "Lord bless you, sir," said Mark, "what is the use of us a going round and round, and hiding behind the corner, and dodging up and down, when we can come straight to the point in 6 words? I've had my eye upon you any time this fortnight. I see well enough there's a screw loose in your affairs. I knowed well enough the first time I see you down at the Dragon that it must be so sooner or later. Now, sir, here am I, without a situation, without any want of wages for a year to come, for I saved up, I didn't mean to do it, but I couldn't help it, at the Dragon. Here am I, with a liking for what's wentersome, and a liking for you, and a wish to come out strong under circumstances as would keep other men down, and will you take me, or will you leave me?" "How can I take you?" cried Martin. "When I say take," rejoined Mark, "I mean will you let me go? And when I say will you let me go, I mean will you let me go along with you? For go I will, somehow or another. Now that you've said America, I see clear at once that that's the place for me to be jolly in. Therefore, if I don't pay my own passage in the ship you go in, sir, I'll pay my own passage in another. And mark my words, if I go alone, it shall be to carry out the principle, in the rottenest, craziest, leakingest tub of a wessel that a place can be got in for love or money. So if I'm lost upon the way, sir, there'll be a drowned man at your door, and always a knocking double knocks at it too, or never trust me." "This is mere folly," said Martin. "Very good, sir," returned Mark. "I'm glad to hear it, because if you don't mean to let me go, you'll be more comfortable, perhaps, on account of thinking so. Therefore I contradict no gentleman. But all I say is, that if I don't emigrate to America in that case, in the beastliest old cockleshell as goes out of port, I'm—" "You don't mean what you say, I'm sure," said Martin. "Yes, I do," cried Mark. "I tell you I know better," rejoined Martin. "Very good, sir," said Mark, with the same air of perfect satisfaction. "Let it stand that way at present, sir, and wait and see how it turns out. Why, love my heart alive, the only doubt I have is whether there's any credit in going with a gentleman like you, that's as certain to make his way there as a gimlet is to go through soft deal." This was touching Martin on his weak point, and having him at a great advantage. He could not help thinking either what a brisk fellow this Mark was, and how great a change he had wrought in the atmosphere of the dismal little room already. "Why, certainly, Mark," he said, "I have hopes of doing well there, or I shouldn't go. I may have the qualifications for doing well, perhaps." "Of course you have, sir," returned Mark happily. "Everybody knows that." "You see," said Martin, leaning his chin upon his hand and looking at the fire, "ornamental architecture applied to domestic purposes can hardly fail to be in great request in that country, for men are constantly changing their residences there and moving further off, and it's clear they must have houses to live in." "I should say, sir," observed Mark, "that that's a state of things as opens one of the jolliest lookouts for domestic architecture that ever I heard tell on." Martin glanced at him hastily, not feeling quite free from a suspicion that this remark implied a doubt of the successful issue of his plans. But Mr. Tapley was eating the boiled beef and bread with such entire good faith and singleness of purpose expressed in his visage, that he could not but be satisfied. Another doubt arose in his mind, however, as this one disappeared. He produced the blank cover in which the note had been enclosed, and fixing his eyes on Mark as he put it in his hands, said, "Now tell me the truth. Do you know anything about that?" Mark turned it over and over, held it near his eyes, held it away from him at arm's length, held it with the superscription upwards and with the superscription downwards, and shook his head with such a genuine expression of astonishment at being asked the question, that Martin said, as he took it from him again, "No, I see you don't. How should you? Though, indeed, your knowing about it would not be more extraordinary than its being here. Come, Tapley," he added, after a moment's thought, "I'll trust you with my history, such as it is, and then you'll see more clearly what sort of fortunes you would link yourself to if you followed me." "I beg your pardon, sir," said Mark, "but afore you enter upon it, will you take me if I choose to go? Will you turn off me, Mark Tapley, formerly of the Blue Dragon, as can be well recommended by Mr. Pinch, and as wants a gentleman of your strength of mind to look up to, or will you, in climbing the ladder as you're certain to get to the top of, take me along with you at a respectful distance?" "Now, sir," said Mark, "it's of very little importance to you, I know. There's the difficulty. But it's of very great importance to me, and will you be so good as to consider of it?" If this were meant as a second appeal to Martin's weak side, founded on his observation of the effect of the first, Mr. Tapley was a skillful and shrewd observer. Whether an intentional or an accidental shot, it hit the mark fully, for Martin, relenting more and more, said, with a condescension which was inexpressibly delicious to him after his recent humiliation, "We'll see about it, Tapley. You shall tell me in what disposition you find yourself to-morrow." "Then, sir," said Mark, rubbing his hands, "the job's done. Go on, sir, if you please. I'm all attention." Throwing himself back in his armchair, and looking at the fire, with now and then a glance at Mark, who at such times nodded his head sagely to express his profound interest and attention, Martin ran over the chief points in his history to the same effect as he had related them weeks before to Mr. Pinch. But he adapted them, according to the best of his judgment, to Mr. Tapley's comprehension, and with that view made as light of his love affair as he could, and referred to it in very few words. But here he reckoned without his host, for Mark's interest was keenest in this part of the business, and prompted him to ask sundry questions in relation to it, for which he apologized as one in some measure privileged to do so, from having seen, as Martin explained to him, the young lady at the Blue Dragon. "And a young lady as any gentleman ought to feel more proud of being in love with," said Mark energetically. "Don't draw breath." "Aye, you saw her when she was not happy," said Martin, gazing at the fire again. "If you had seen her in the old times, indeed!" "Why, she certainly was a little downhearted, sir, and something paler in her colour than I could have wished," said Mark, "but none the worse in her looks for that. I think she seemed better, sir, after she come to London." Martin withdrew his eyes from the fire, stared at Mark as if he thought he had suddenly gone mad, and asked him what he meant. "No offence intended, sir," urged Mark. "I don't mean to say she was any the happier without you, but I thought she was a looking better, sir." "Do you mean to tell me she has been in London?" asked Martin, rising hurriedly and pushing back his chair. "Of course I do," said Mark, rising too, in great amazement from the bedstead. "Do you mean to tell me she is in London now?" "Most likely, sir. I mean to say she was a week ago." "And you know where?" "Yes," cried Mark. "What, don't you?" "My good fellow," exclaimed Martin, clutching him by both arms, "I have never seen her since I left my grandfather's house." "Why, then," cried Mark, giving the little table such a blow with his clenched fist that the slices of beef and ham danced upon it, while all his features seemed, with delight, to be going up into his forehead, and never coming back again any more, "if I an't your natural born servant, hired by fate, there an't such a thing in natur as a blue dragon. What? When I was a rambling up and down a old churchyard in the city, getting myself into a jolly state, didn't I see your grandfather a toddling to and fro for pretty nigh a mortal hour? Didn't I watch him into Todgers's commercial boarding house, and watch him out, and watch him home to his hotel, and go and tell him as his was the service for my money, and I had said so afore I left the Dragon? Wasn't the young lady a sitting with him then, and didn't she fall a laughing in a manner as was beautiful to see? Didn't your grandfather say, 'Come back again next week,' and didn't I go next week, and didn't he say that he couldn't make up his mind to trust nobody no more, and therefore wouldn't engage me, but at the same time stood something to drink as was handsome? Why," cried Mr. Tapley, with a comical mixture of delight and chagrin, "where's the credit of a man's being jolly under such circumstances? Who could help it when things come about like this?" For some moments Martin stood gazing at him as if he really doubted the evidence of his senses, and could not believe that Mark stood there, in the body, before him. At length he asked him whether, if the young lady were still in London, he thought he could contrive to deliver a letter to her secretly. "Do I think I can?" cried Mark. "Think I can? Here, sit down, sir. Write it out, sir." With that he cleared the table by the summary process of tilting everything upon it into the fireplace, snatched some writing materials from the mantel shelf, set Martin's chair before them, forced him down into it, dipped a pen into the ink, and put it in his hand. "Cut away, sir," cried Mark. "Make it strong, sir. Let it be wery p'inted, sir. Do I think so? I should think so. Go to work, sir." Martin required no further adjuration, but went to work at a great rate, while Mr. Tapley, installing himself without any more formalities into the functions of his valet and general attendant, divested himself of his coat, and went on to clear the fireplace and arrange the room, talking to himself in a low voice the whole time. "Jolly sort of lodgings," said Mark, rubbing his nose with a knob at the end of the fire shovel, and looking round the poor chamber. "That's a comfort. The rain's come through the roof too. That ain't bad. A lively old bedstead, I'll be bound, populated by lots of wampires, no doubt. Come, my spirits is a getting up again. An uncommon ragged nightcap this. A very good sign. We shall do yet. Here, Jane, my dear," calling down the stairs, "bring up that there hot tumbler for my master, as was a mixing when I come in. That's right, sir," to Martin. "Go at it as if you meant it, sir. Be very tender, sir, if you please. You can't make it too strong, sir." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 14, in which Martin bids adieu to the lady of his love, and honours an obscure individual whose fortune he intends to make by commending her to his protection. The letter being duly signed, sealed, and delivered, was handed to Mark Tapley, for immediate conveyance, if possible, and he succeeded so well in his embassy as to be enabled to return that same night, just as the house was closing, with the welcome intelligence that he had sent it upstairs to the young lady, enclosed in a small manuscript of his own, purporting to contain his further petition to be engaged in Mr. Chuzzlewit's service, and that she had herself come down and told him, in great haste and agitation, that she would meet the gentleman at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning in St. James's Park. It was then agreed between the new master and the new man that Mark should be in waiting near the hotel in good time to escort the young lady to the place of appointment. And when they had parted for the night with this understanding, Martin took up his pen again, and before he went to bed wrote another letter, whereof more will be seen presently. He was up before daybreak, and came upon the park with the morning, which was clad in the least engaging of the 365 dresses in the wardrobe of the year. It was raw, damp, dark, and dismal. The clouds were as muddy as the ground, and the short perspective of every street and avenue was closed up by the mist as by a filthy curtain. "Fine weather indeed," Martin bitterly soliloquized, "to be wandering up and down herein like a thief. Fine weather indeed for a meeting of lovers in the open air and in a public walk. I need be departing with all speed for another country, for I have come to a pretty pass in this." He might perhaps have gone on to reflect that of all mornings in the year it was not the best calculated for a young lady's coming forth on such an errand either, but he was stopped on the road to this reflection, if his thoughts tended that way, by her appearance at a short distance, on which he hurried forward to meet her. Her squire, Mr. Tapley, at the same time fell discreetly back, and surveyed the fog above him with an appearance of attentive interest. "My dear Martin," said Mary. "My dear Mary," said Martin. And lovers are such a singular kind of people that this is all they did say just then, though Martin took her arm and her hand too, and they paced up and down a short walk that was least exposed to observation half a dozen times. "If you have changed at all, my love, since we parted," said Martin at length, as he looked upon her with a proud delight, "it is only to be more beautiful than ever." Had she been of the common metal of love-worn young ladies, she would have denied this in her most interesting manner, and would have told him that she knew she had become a perfect fright, or that she had wasted away with weeping and anxiety, or that she was dwindling gently into an early grave, or that her mental sufferings were unspeakable, or would, either by tears or words, or a mixture of both, have furnished him with some other information to that effect, and made him as miserable as possible. But she had been reared up in a sterner school than the minds of most young girls are formed in, and she had her nature strengthened by the hands of hard endurance and necessity, had come out from her young trials constant, self-denying, earnest, and devoted, had acquired in her maidenhood, whether happily in the end for herself or him, is foreign to our present purpose to inquire, something of that nobler quality of gentle hearts which is developed often by the sorrows and struggles of matronly years, but often by their lessons only. Unspoiled, unpampered in her joys or griefs, with frank and full and deep affection for the object of her early love, she saw in him one who for her sake was an outcast from his home and fortune, and she had no more idea of bestowing that love upon him in other than cheerful and sustaining words, full of high hope and grateful trustfulness, than she had of being unworthy of it, in her lightest thought or deed, for any base temptation that the world could offer. "What change is there in you, Martin?" she replied, "for that concerns me nearest. You look more anxious and more thoughtful than you used." "Why, as to that, my love," said Martin, as he drew her waist within his arm, first looking round to see that there were no observers near, and beholding Mr. Tapley more intent than ever on the fog, "it would be strange if I did not, for my life, especially of late, has been a hard one." "I know it must have been," she answered. "When have I forgotten to think of it, and you?" "Not often, I hope," said Martin. "Not often, I am sure. Not often I have some right to expect, Mary, for I have undergone a great deal of vexation and privation, and I naturally look for that return, you know." "A very, very poor return," she answered, with a fainter smile. "But you have it, and will have it always. You have paid a dear price for a poor heart, Martin, but it is at least your own, and a true one." "Of course I feel quite certain of that," said Martin, "or I shouldn't have put myself in my present position. And don't say a poor heart, Mary, for I say a rich one. Now I am about to break a design to you, dearest, which will startle you at first, but which is undertaken for your sake. I am going," he added slowly, looking far into the deep wonder of her bright dark eyes, "abroad." "Abroad, Martin?" "Only to America. See now, How you droop directly!" "If I do, or I hope I may say if I did," she answered, raising her head after a short silence, and looking once more into his face, "it was for grief to think of what you are resolved to undergo for me. I would not venture to dissuade you, Martin, but it is a long, long distance. There is a wide ocean to be crossed. Illness and want are sad calamities in any place, but in a foreign country dreadful to endure. Have you thought of all this?" "Thought of it!" cried Martin, abating in his fondness, and he was very fond of her, hardly an iota of his usual impetuosity. "What am I to do? It's very well to say, have I thought of it, my love, but you should ask me in the same breath, have I thought of starving at home? Have I thought of doing porter's work for a living? Have I thought of holding horses in the streets to earn my roll of bread from day to day? Come, come," he added in a gentler tone, "do not hang down your head, my dear, for I need the encouragement that your sweet face alone can give me. Why, that's well. Now you are brave again." "I am endeavouring to be," she answered, smiling through her tears. "Endeavouring to be anything that's good, and being it, is with you all one. Don't I know that of old?" cried Martin gaily. "So that's famous. Now I can tell you all my plans as cheerfully as if you were my little wife already, Mary." She hung more closely on his arm, and looking upwards in his face, bade him speak on. "You see," said Martin, playing with the little hand upon his wrist, "that my attempts to advance myself at home have been baffled and rendered abortive. I will not say by whom, Mary, for that would give pain to us both, but so it is. Have you heard him speak of late of any relative of mine or his called Pecksniff? Only tell me what I ask you, no more." "I have heard, to my surprise, that he is a better man than was supposed." "I thought so," interrupted Martin. "And that it is likely we may come to know him, if not to visit and reside with him, and, I think, his daughters. He has daughters, has he, love?" "A pair of them," Martin answered, "a precious pair, gems of the first water." "Ah, you are jesting." "There is a sort of jesting which is very much in earnest, and includes some pretty serious disgust," said Martin. "I jest in reference to Mr. Pecksniff, at whose house I have been living as his assistant, and at whose hands I have received insult and injury. In that vein, whatever betides, or however closely you may be brought into communication with this family, never forget that, Mary, and never for an instant, whatever appearances may seem to contradict me, lose sight of this assurance: Pecksniff is a scoundrel." "Indeed!" "In thought and in deed, and in everything else. A scoundrel from the topmost hair of his head to the nethermost atom of his heel. Of his daughters I will only say, that to the best of my knowledge and belief, they are dutiful young ladies, and take after their father closely. This is a digression from the main point, and yet it brings me to what I was going to say." He stopped to look into her eyes again, and seeing, in a hasty glance over his shoulder, that there was no one near, and that Mark was still intent upon the fog, not only looked at her lips too, but kissed them into the bargain. "Now I am going to America with great prospects of doing well, and of returning home myself very soon. It may be to take you there for a few years, but at all events to claim you for my wife, which, after such trials, I should do with no fear of your still thinking it a duty to cleave to him who will not suffer me to live, for this is true, if he can help it, in my own land. How long I may be absent is of course uncertain, but it shall not be very long, trust me for that." "In the meantime, dear Martin—" "That's the very thing I am coming to. In the meantime you shall hear constantly of all my goings on, thus." He paused to take from his pocket the letter he had written overnight, and then resumed: "In this fellow's employment, and living in this fellow's house, by fellow I mean Mr. Pecksniff, of course, there is a certain person of the name of Pinch, don't forget, a poor, strange, simple oddity, Mary, but thoroughly honest and sincere, full of zeal, and with a cordial regard for me, which I mean to return one of these days by setting him up in life in some way or other." "Your old kind nature, Martin." "Oh," said Martin, "that's not worth speaking of, my love. He's very grateful and desirous to serve me, and I am more than repaid. Now one night I told this Pinch my history, and all about myself and you, in which he was not a little interested, I can tell you, for he knows you. Aye, you may look surprised, and the longer the better, for it becomes you. But you have heard him play the organ in the church of that village before now, and he has seen you listening to his music, and has caught his inspiration from you too." "Was he the organist?" cried Mary. "I thank him from my heart." "Yes, he was," said Martin, "and is, and gets nothing for it either. There never was such a simple fellow, quite an infant, but a very good sort of creature, I assure you." "I am sure of that," she said with great earnestness. "He must be." "Oh yes, no doubt at all about it," rejoined Martin, in his usual careless way. "He is. Well, it has occurred to me, but stay. If I read you what I have written and intend sending to him by post tonight, it will explain itself. My dear Tom Pinch. That's rather familiar, perhaps," said Martin, suddenly remembering that he was proud when they had last met. "But I call him my dear Tom Pinch because he likes it and it pleases him." "Very right, and very kind," said Mary. "Exactly so," cried Martin. "It's as well to be kind whenever one can, and, as I said before, he really is an excellent fellow. My dear Tom Pinch, I address this under cover to Mrs. Lupin at the Blue Dragon, and have begged her in a short note to deliver it to you without saying anything about it elsewhere, and to do the same with all future letters she may receive from me. My reason for so doing will be at once apparent to you." "I don't know that it will be, by the by," said Martin, breaking off, "for he's slow of comprehension, poor fellow, but he'll find it out in time. My reason simply is that I don't want my letters to be read by other people, and particularly by the scoundrel whom he thinks an angel." "Mr. Pecksniff again?" asked Mary. "The same," said Martin. "Will be at once apparent to you. I have completed my arrangements for going to America, and you will be surprised to hear that I am to be accompanied by Mark Tapley, upon whom I have stumbled strangely in London, and who insists on putting himself under my protection. Meaning, my love," said Martin, breaking off again, "our friend in the rear, of course." She was delighted to hear this, and bestowed a kind glance upon Mark, which he brought his eyes down from the fog to encounter, and received with immense satisfaction. She said in his hearing, too, that he was a good soul and a merry creature, and would be faithful, she was certain. Commendations which Mr. Tapley inwardly resolved to deserve from such lips if he died for it. "Now, my dear Pinch," resumed Martin, proceeding with his letter, "I am going to repose great trust in you, knowing that I may do so with perfect reliance on your honour and secrecy, and having nobody else just now to trust in." "I don't think I would say that, Martin. Wouldn't you? Well, I'll take that out as perfectly true, though. But it might seem ungracious, perhaps." "Oh, I don't mind Pinch," said Martin. "There's no occasion to stand on any ceremony with him. However, I'll take it out as you wish it, and make the letter full stop at secrecy. Very well. I shall not only— this is the letter again, you know." "I understand." "I shall not only enclose my letters to the young lady of whom I have told you, to your charge, to be forwarded as she may request, but I most earnestly commit her, the young lady herself, to your care and regard, in the event of your meeting in my absence. I have reason to think that the probabilities of your encountering each other, perhaps very frequently, are now neither remote nor few, and although in our position you can do very little to lessen the uneasiness of hers, I trust to you implicitly to do that much, and so deserve the confidence I have reposed in you. You see, my dear Mary," said Martin, "it will be a great consolation to you to have anybody, no matter how simple, with whom you can speak about me, and the very first time you talk to Pinch, you'll feel at once that there is no more occasion for any embarrassment or hesitation in talking to him than if he were an old woman." "However that may be," she returned, smiling, "he is your friend, and that is enough." "Oh yes, he's my friend," said Martin, "certainly. In fact, I have told him in so many words that we'll always take notice of him and protect him, and it's a good trait in his character that he's grateful, very grateful indeed. You'll like him of all things, my love, I know. You'll observe very much that's comical and old-fashioned about Pinch, but you needn't mind laughing at him, for he'll not care about it. He'll rather like it, indeed." "I don't think I shall put that to the test, Martin." "You won't if you can help it, of course," he said, "but I think you'll find him a little too much for your gravity. However, that's neither here nor there, and it certainly is not the letter, which ends thus: Knowing that I need not impress the nature and extent of that confidence upon you at any greater length, as it is already sufficiently established in your mind, I will only say, in bidding you farewell, and looking forward to our next meeting, that I shall charge myself from this time, through all changes for the better, with your advancement and happiness, as if they were my own. You may rely upon that. And always believe me, my dear Tom Pinch, faithfully your friend, Martin Chuzzlewit. P.S. I enclose the amount which you so kindly— "Oh," said Martin, checking himself and folding up the letter, "that's nothing." At this crisis Mark Tapley interposed, with an apology for remarking that the clock at the Horse Guards was striking. "Which I shouldn't have said nothing about, sir," added Mark, "if the young lady hadn't begged me to be particular in mentioning it." "I did," said Mary. "Thank you. You were quite right. In another minute I shall be ready to return. We have time for a very few words more, dear Martin, and although I had much to say, it must remain unsaid until the happy time of our next meeting. Heaven send it may come speedily and prosperously, but I have no fear of that." "Fear!" cried Martin. "Why, who has? What are a few months? What is a whole year? When I come gaily back, with a road through life hewn out before me, then indeed, looking back upon this parting, it may seem a dismal one. But now, I swear I wouldn't have it happen under more favourable auspices if I could, for then I should be less inclined to go, and less impressed with the necessity." "Yes, yes, I feel that too. When do you go?" "Tonight. We leave for Liverpool tonight. A vessel sails from that port, as I hear, in 3 days. In a month or less we shall be there." "Why, what's a month? How many months have flown by since our last parting?" "Long to look back upon," said Mary, echoing his cheerful tone, "but nothing in their course." "Nothing at all," cried Martin. "I shall have change of scene and change of place, change of people, change of manners, change of cares and hopes. Time will wear wings indeed. I can bear anything, so that I have swift action, Mary." Was he thinking solely of her care for him when he took so little heed of her share in the separation, of her quiet, monotonous endurance, and her slow anxiety from day to day? Was there nothing jarring and discordant, even in his tone of courage, with this one note self, for ever audible, however high the strain? Not in her ears. It had been better otherwise, perhaps, but so it was. She heard the same bold spirit which had flung away as dross all gain and profit for her sake, making light of peril and privation that she might be calm and happy. And she heard no more. That heart where self has found no place and raised no throne is slow to recognize its ugly presence when it looks upon it. As one possessed of an evil spirit was held in old time to be alone conscious of the lurking demon in the breasts of other men, so kindred vices know each other in their hiding places every day, when virtue is incredulous and blind. "The quarter's gone," cried Mr. Tapley in a voice of admonition. "I shall be ready to return immediately," she said. "One thing, dear Martin, I am bound to tell you. You entreated me a few minutes since only to answer what you asked me in reference to one theme, but you should and must know, otherwise I could not be at ease, that since that separation of which I was the unhappy occasion, he has never once uttered your name, has never coupled it, or any faint allusion to it, with passion or reproach, and has never abated in his kindness to me." "I thank him for that last act," said Martin, "and for nothing else. Though on consideration I may thank him for his other forbearance also, inasmuch as I neither expect nor desire that he will mention my name again. He may once, perhaps, to couple it with reproach in his will. Let him, if he please. By the time it reaches me he will be in his grave, a satire on his own anger, God help him. Martin, if you would but sometimes, in some quiet hour beside the winter fire, in the summer air, when you hear gentle music, or think of death, or home, or childhood, if you would at such a season resolve to think but once a month, or even once a year, of him, or any one who ever wronged you, you would forgive him in your heart, I know." "If I believed that to be true, Mary," he replied, "I would resolve at no such time to bear him in my mind, wishing to spare myself the shame of such a weakness. I was not born to be the toy and puppet of any man, far less his, to whose pleasure and caprice, in return for any good he did me, my whole youth was sacrificed. It became between us two a fair exchange, a barter, and no more, and there is no such balance against me that I need throw in a mawkish forgiveness to poise the scale. He has forbidden all mention of me to you, I know," he added hastily. "Come, has he not?" "That was long ago," she returned, "immediately after your parting, before you had left the house. He has never done so since." "He has never done so since because he has seen no occasion," said Martin, "but that is of little consequence one way or other. Let all allusion to him between you and me be interdicted from this time forth. And therefore, love," he drew her quickly to him, for the time of parting had now come, "in the first letter that you write to me through the post office, addressed to New York, and in all the others that you send through Pinch, remember he has no existence, but has become to us as one who is dead. Now, God bless you. This is a strange place for such a meeting and such a parting, but our next meeting shall be in a better, and our next and last parting in a worse." "One other question, Martin, I must ask. Have you provided money for this journey?" "Have I?" cried Martin. It might have been in his pride, it might have been in his desire to set her mind at ease. "Have I provided money? Why, there's a question for an emigrant's wife. How could I move on land or sea without it, love?" "I mean enough." "Enough? More than enough. 20 times more than enough. A pocket full. Mark and I, for all essential ends, are quite as rich as if we had the purse of Fortunatus in our baggage." "The half hour's a-going," cried Mr. Tapley. "Good-bye 100 times," cried Mary in a trembling voice. But how cold the comfort in good-bye! Mark Tapley knew it perfectly. Perhaps he knew it from his reading, perhaps from his experience, perhaps from intuition. It is impossible to say. But however he knew it, his knowledge instinctively suggested to him the wisest course of proceeding that any man could have adopted under the circumstances. He was taken with a violent fit of sneezing, and was obliged to turn his head another way, in doing which he, in a manner, fenced and screened the lovers into a corner by themselves. There was a short pause, but Mark had an undefined sensation that it was a satisfactory one in its way. Then Mary, with her veil lowered, passed him with a quick step, and beckoned him to follow. She stopped once more before they lost that corner, looked back, and waved her hand to Martin. He made a start towards them at the moment, as if he had some other farewell words to say, but she only hurried off the faster, and Mr. Tapley followed as in duty bound. When he rejoined Martin again in his own chamber, he found that gentleman seated moodily before the dusty grate, with his 2 feet on the fender, his 2 elbows on his knees, and his chin supported, in a not very ornamental manner, on the palms of his hands. "Well, Mark?" "Well, sir," said Mark, taking a long breath, "I see the young lady safe home, and I feel pretty comfortable after it. She sent a lot of kind words, sir, and this," handing him a ring, "for a parting keepsake." "Diamonds," said Martin, kissing it. "Let us do him justice. It was for her sake, not for theirs," and putting it on his little finger, "splendid diamonds. My grandfather is a singular character, Mark. He must have given her this now." Mark Tapley knew as well that she had bought it, to the end that that unconscious speaker might carry some article of sterling value with him in his necessity, as he knew that it was day and not night. Though he had no more acquaintance of his own knowledge with the history of the glittering trinket on Martin's outspread finger than Martin himself had, he was as certain that in its purchase she had expended her whole stock of hoarded money, as if he had seen it paid down coin by coin. Her lover's strange obtuseness in relation to this little incident promptly suggested to Mark's mind its real cause and root, and from that moment he had a clear and perfect insight into the one absorbing principle of Martin's character. "She is worthy of the sacrifices I have made," said Martin, folding his arms and looking at the ashes in the stove, as if in resumption of some former thoughts. "Well worthy of them. No riches," here he stroked his chin and mused, "could have compensated for the loss of such a nature. Not to mention that in gaining her affection I have followed the bent of my own wishes, and balked the selfish schemes of others who had no right to form them. She is quite worthy, more than worthy, of the sacrifices I have made. Yes, she is, no doubt of it." These ruminations might or might not have reached Mark Tapley, for though they were by no means addressed to him, yet they were softly uttered. In any case, he stood there watching Martin with an indescribable and most involved expression on his visage, until that young man roused himself and looked towards him, when he turned away, as being suddenly intent upon certain preparations for the journey, and, without giving vent to any articulate sound, smiled with surpassing ghastliness, and seemed, by a twist of his features and a motion of his lips, to release himself of this word, "Jolly." Chapter 14.